Chapter 3 is on buyer behavior, and we will discuss consumer decision making. The process is usually described in 5 or 6 steps, as well as organizational decisions that arise during the consumer decision making process and how companies can understand how consumers make decisions and then subsequently make decisions for the organization based on that understanding. We'll talk about the internal influences on buyer behavior as well as the external. And then we'll broaden our discussion of the customer to include organizations as buyers. So in other words, we will talk about basically what we call B2C communications, which is business to customer or consumer, and then B2B, businesses to other businesses. And that's more of the organizational decision making here at the bottom of your slide. Let's get started. Let's talk about the buyer decision process. This begins with a recognition that you have a need or a problem. This can be anything from understanding you have a physiological need, like you have a stomach growl or you are thirsty, all the way to more psychological needs, like you're lonely and you'd like to be around other people, or you want to be more respected, you have a need for self-esteem. In all of these cases, that first step of recognizing a need or a problem is what begins the buyer decision process. It's what motivates you to begin the next steps. The next step involves searching for information of alternatives, evaluating those alternatives, making the purchase decision, and then finally post-purchase evaluation. And the arrow from post-purchase evaluation back to the purchase decision is really in the form of potential regret. So we don't want to have negative post-purchase emotions, so that might actually affect your purchase decisions. And we'll talk about that on the next few slides. So this need or problem recognition begins with understanding that there's a discrepancy between where you actually are and where you would like to be. As I said, that could be parched mouth. So you realize that your actual state is that you're thirsty, and your desired state is that you don't want to be thirsty anymore. To more psychological needs. In either case, that discrepancy between the actual and desired state is what motivates you to engage in solving the problem. The second step is to search for information on how you can solve this problem. What humans do from a heuristic or shortcut perspective is that we first look internally. So we recall from memory any time we had the same discrepancy previously and how we solved it then. However, some discrepancies require external search, because it might be the first time we've ever encountered such a need. That external search for information can be from other people or other sources, such as other people within the public, media, corporate advertising or corporate messages, etc. These personal sources can be families and friends, our social networks, even commercial sources, such as your retail environment, their websites, their advertisements, their product literature. And we take this information and we start to identify potential alternatives to that can all solve our problem. So if we are lucky, we have multiple, at the end of the information search stage, we have multiple potential alternatives to choose from. Now, if we were being extremely careful, we would then evaluate those alternatives. So this is the third step of the consumer decision-making process. And I want to explore here an example of using cereals. Now, in this particular case, what we are assuming here is that we are going to evaluate cereal on its taste, on its caloric count, and on its organic claims, and finally on price. Notice when we do this, we are also putting weights on each of these attributes. So notice, for example, that taste is the most important thing to this particular consumer, and price is not as important. Now, certain customers, price would be the most important, and these other claims would be secondary. Now, if we have three different considerations here, for example, Cheerios, Post Grape Nuts, and Kashi, we would rate each product on the four different attributes. So notice that here we're rating Cheerios on these four, we're rating Post on the four, and we're rating Kashi on the four. Now, if we take the rating multiplied by the importance weight plus the next rating multiplied by the importance rate, and so on, we would get an overall score of 8.2 for Cheerios, 7.1 for Post, and 7.2 for Kashi. If, however, we were prioritizing calories, Post would win. If we were prioritizing organic claims, Kashi would win. And this is just to illustrate, or if we were using an overall sort of additive or multiplicative decision-making rule, we would choose Cheerios. So this is just to illustrate that this is a very logical assumption that we go through and evaluate our alternatives very carefully, and then choose something to be kind of the rule. In the case of Cheerios, it would be the overall score. In the case of Post, we would choose it if we felt like calories were most important, and we would choose Kashi if we felt organic claims were most important. However, what we know as marketers and what we know as consumers ourselves is that we don't normally do this, especially for something like Cheerios or a cereal. We make decisions oftentimes based on some other kind of shortcut, maybe past behavior. And as the product becomes more important, as your text talks about, you might go through this process slower or more carefully. But for the most part, step 3 of evaluation of alternatives means that you have narrowed down your consideration set to these 3 cereals, and you are going to choose one from these 3 based on what happens in this phase. So now let's say we've purchased our product, okay? And I don't want to get too much into that particular stage. You can read about it in your book, but obviously you're still deciding where you're buying, from whom you're buying, etc. What I'm more concerned about from a marketing standpoint is what happens after the purchase. Now, if we go back to chapter 1 and talk about those orientations, in the sales orientation, companies didn't care about this phase of the consumer decision-making process. Why? Because all they cared about was getting to the sale. Always be closing, make that sale, okay? Because they moved on from that town to the next town. But in a more competitive environment where customers have more choices, then the post-purchase phase becomes extremely important to businesses to understand. And there's 3 likely outcomes in this phase of consumer decision making. If the product or service's performance is less than what customers expected, now expectations is important, what they expected, then they're dissatisfied. If performance is equal to expectations, they're satisfied. And here's an interesting effect of just our brains. Whoops, let me pause while the dog barks. If performance is greater than what your customers expected, then they're delighted. This is really important because we want them to be delighted and surprised in a way that the product worked better than expected. Okay, so but we can't lead with that, because if we set their expectations too high, they're unrealistic and your product or service can't meet it. But if we set our expectations realistically and then give them even more, whether that more is in product attributes, better value, better service, those types of things really enhance the experience that the customers have, leading to post-purchase delight. What we want to avoid is something called post-purchase cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is that feeling of post-purchase tension that arises when you're not quite sure you made the right choice. And we've all felt that before, that little nagging second sense that you made the wrong choice. And so this is where, if you go back to the slide that had the phases of the consumer decision-making process on the diagonal, this is where making people aware of this post-purchase potential for tension before they make their purchase can have big effects on whether they make the purchase to begin with. So in other words, if I think I'm going to regret it, if I think I'm going to regret buying the cheaper airfare because I'm going to pay more for my luggage, or I'm going to have more uncomfortable seating, or the times that I'm flying are not going to be conducive. If I feel like I might regret that, I might pay more, decide to pay more for the name brand product or service. Okay, so if you are the market pioneer, as we talked about in the previous chapter, you may end up getting people to think about how you don't want to have regret, so you should go with the well-known or well-established product or service. We see this a lot in political advertising, for example. So you make people fearful of change, and they then vote for the status quo. This is why incumbents have such a strong potential of being reelected. So this post-purchase cognitive dissonance is a very powerful motivating tool that can lead to all sorts of implications for marketers. Ultimately, what this also means is that after the choice is made, after the purchase, companies still need to communicate with their customers to convince the customers that they made the right choice. So marketing's role does continue after the purchase, especially for products or services that will be purchased again over time, because you want your customers to be delighted and to avoid tension and to hopefully be your advocates and talk about your product or service to others. Now, affecting this progression through the decision-making phases are the environment or the situation that the consumer is in. Is this a routine problem-solving situation? Routine problem-solving situations are things like, my stomach is growling, I need a snack. So it's a regular purchase, it's relatively low risk. So examples of that would be drinks or snacks or bread or something like that. It's routine. We don't go through the entire grocery aisle and evaluate every single possible alternative in these routine problem-solving situations. We also may be in what's called a limited problem-solving situation, where these are possibly less frequently purchased. They might have greater risk in the sense of you don't purchase them very often. An example might be a laptop or a phone or a camera. So you might go through the phases a bit more carefully. And then finally, you have extended problem solving, which are things that might be rarely purchased and have very high risk, like in a home or an apartment or a flat or condominium, something like that, or a car. And so these are oftentimes you are being very careful about how you proceed through the decision-making process. That brings us to the concept of psychological involvement. For example, when you see a message, an advertisement, if you are highly involved in the discrepancy or the problem to begin with, then you're going to pay more attention to the ad and you're going to process it deeper into your long-term memory. And that might lead to stronger attitudes and purchase intentions. Whereas if this is a routine problem or something that you're just not very involved in yourself, then you're less attention and you're going to be persuaded by peripheral cues. Peripheral cues are everything from color to a call out on the packaging, to the shape of the packaging. And in these cases, they're weak attitudes and might mean that you rely on these sort of cues to make your decision. So you grab the green box because you think it has more organic or it's more environmentally friendly as opposed to, the other box of cereal. Involvement is affected by your self-image, it's affected by perceived risk of the purchase, social factors, and even hedonism. The details 4 different buyer behavior types based on involvement and brand differences. So for example, if it is a high involvement purchase decision and the customer perceives that there is a lot of differences between brand offerings, then it's a complex situation. If it's a low involvement situation, remember this is less risk, and there's high differences between brands, that can be a variety seeking situation for the buyer. When you're highly involved, but there's not much difference between brands, then we call that a dissonance reducing buyer behavior. And low involvement with low differences between brands is a habitual buyer situation. I would recommend that as you read through the chapter in this section, you put some examples in your own life into each of these boxes, where you've had a complex decision, where you've had a variety seeking situation, where you've had a dissonance reducing buyer experience, and where you've had a habitual buyer experience. That will help you to solidify and understand the distinctions between these. Other influences on the buying situation or on buying behavior are internal to the customer, to the buyer themselves. So that can be anything from personality to cognitive perception. This is like your brain and how fast you process information, how you filter information, how you recall information. It can be based on your learning style, your motivations, and your attitudes and beliefs about the product, about the brands, about the buying situation, about the partners that are involved, such as the retail stores, the employees, etc. Whereas external influences on buying behavior are things like we discussed in chapter 2, but at the more specific level related to the customer, such as culture, reference groups. And just as an aside on reference group, we have 3 different types of reference groups. We have membership groups. These are the groups you currently belong to and how they might affect the decision-making process. Aspiration groups, these are groups you want to belong to. So if you want to belong to a particular university, you may, so you aspire to be a student at that university, you may buy clothing that reflects that university, so because it's where you want to go. And I think a very interesting motivational reference group is the dissociative group. This is the group that you don't want to belong to. And it's important for companies that are targeting a particular market segment to understand who they don't want to be like, right? So if you're targeting millennials, millennials might not want to look like their parents very much. So they don't want to be marketed the same way. They don't want to see their parents in the same clothing. They don't want to see their parents in the same shoes. They don't want to have their parents talking the same way or liking the same movies sometimes. So it's important to understand your target market, to understand who they want to belong to, who they don't want to belong to, and how they currently identify. That would be their membership group. Their external influences are anything from the social networks that one belongs to and the messaging that occurs in those environments, to family, and to the buying roles of the buyer. So are they buying the product for themselves? Are they buying the product for others? Now, that being said, when we have a new product decision to make, we tend to go through these stages of awareness, interest, evaluation and trial, and adoption. See if I can write very well, but this is also called the AID for desire, and then adoption model. So here, desire is often a function of both evaluation and trial. So we see this in new products where we have to go through these stages to even be aware that a product or service can meet that particular need, our interest in getting more information about that product or service, evaluating it in the context of other alternatives you're considering, trying or purchasing the product or service, and then adopting it. Adopting it means not just the purchase itself, that's trial. Adoption really is much more of almost a loyalty perspective. This is called the adoption curve, and this is the percentage of all adopters. I want to highlight these 5 different categories of buyers and which ones are most important to marketers. Who are marketers actually talking to? So the first group of people who buy your product, especially if you have a new product, so this is sort of a continuation from the previous slide, those are called innovators. And we all know those people. They're the ones that are the first to purchase in a particular product category. So I have a friend who really is sort of my technological innovator, and he is the first to buy a Tesla. He was the first that I knew to have an iPhone and kind of evaluate different potential technology advancements. So I really look to him oftentimes to be that innovator. The next group are called early adopters. These are people who wait a little bit and wait till marketing comes into play a bit, and they're the first opinion group to purchase the product. Then we have the early majority or the early mainstream and the late mainstream. Taken together, these people comprise the majority of the market. So 34 and 34 is 68% of the market are considered early mainstream or late mainstream. And the last group are called the laggards or the lagging adopters. These are people who buy a product category very late or maybe sometimes never adopt that category. So you can think of maybe grandparents or older people you know that still don't have a smartphone. Now, why this is important to marketers is because we have different communication strategies depending on which of these groups someone falls into. So for example, if you are an innovator, marketing doesn't have much of a play or much of an influence on your decisions. You often have the internal knowledge to make that decision or the industry knowledge. Whereas marketing does play a role in these middle 3 groupings in particular. And in the middle 3 groups, for marketers, we want early adopters to use and try our products or services. And that's because the early mainstream or the early majority people really look to early adopters as a promotional communication, people they trust to tell them what they should buy. The reason that the early majority and the late majority are divided is because early mainstream people are influenced by early adopters. That's why you have the early and early denominations or discussions there. But the late mainstream tend to be motivated more by money. And so they will adopt a product once it becomes less expensive to adopt, okay? Whereas early mainstream people adopt a product when they see others in their opinion group or others in their aspirational group beginning to adopt the product or service. So you can see how even in just our discussions of each of these groups, marketing activity changes. So, and then finally, lagging adopters or laggards, as they're also called, they might never be the target for marketing communications. So again, that's kind of why really marketers focus on the three middle groups, which comprise really about 80-something% of the market, over 80% of the total market space. And some people you're never going to reach. So better to kind of put your efforts into understanding how these middle three groups in the adoption curve are influenced by different persuasive communications, different pricing strategies, different product developments. So now as we kind of transition from talking about individual consumers to corporate or business consumers buy in larger quantities. They negotiate harder on delivery terms, so that invisible P of the 4 Ps that most individual consumers don't really think about, organizational consumers think a lot about. They expect reduced prices for bulk buying. They might require modifications in the product. They're harder to please. There's more people involved in the decision to purchase. It might take longer for the sale. The book discusses 3 types of organizational buying situations. The straight rebuy. This is a direct reorder without any modifications. A modified rebuy, where the buyer wants to change or modify product specifications in some way. And a new task or a new buy. And this is where the buyer is purchasing a product or service for the first time. And it requires a longer decision process because a full negotiation of contracts are usually required in this stage. And then finally, the text talks about the different people involved in making the purchase decision, from the gatekeeper to the financer to the final decider. All of these people might be different than the actual user of the business product. So for example, if you are buying a new machinery for a manufacturing floor, the gatekeeper may be the administrative assistant that determines whether or not the salesperson ever really even gets their foot in the door or gets their request for proposal heard. The decider may be the manager who kind of stamps and gives the final stamp of approval on the purchase. And the user may be the employee who actually utilizes that product or service, but doesn't necessarily have a say in other aspects of the purchase decision. So each of these roles are necessary. Sometimes these distinctions are kind of collapsed across multiple people or collapsed across a single person. So a single person might be the user and the initiator of the buying decision. And it's important as a business to understand how the decision is being made when your customer is another business. So we need to know who is the gatekeeper, who is the decider, who is influencing the decision, who is the financer, who's going to sign that check and that contract. So the buying center is an entirely different strategy for sales than a individual consumer buyer. Finally, it's important when we're talking about the distinction between individual customers and businesses as customers, understanding what's called derived demand. Derived demand is business demand that comes from the demand for consumer goods. For example, the demand for fertilizer comes from the demand for corn, comes from the demand for beef. Or the demand for lumber comes from the demand for individual houses, which comes from individual buyers. The demand for tires comes from or depends on the demand for cars. So in each of these examples, you can read the arrow as being depends on. So fertilizer depends on the demand for corn, depends on the demand for beef. So if beef consumption or demand goes down, then fertilizer demand goes down. If demand for cars goes up, then the derived demand for tires also goes up. And then something we'll discuss later in pricing is inelastic demand. This is when changes in price don't lead to changes in the price of the final product. And we'll talk about inelastic and elastic demand when we discuss pricing, because inelastic demand means that your customers are less sensitive to pricing changes. We would like to use branding as a way to make demand for our products more inelastic. We want inelastic demand if we're a company. If we're a customer, we would like elastic demand, but that's another story for another day. But understanding how willing customers are to pay for products or services, and in this particular case, understanding how demand for the downstream materials affects the demand for your final product are very important. So imagine that you are a restaurant and demand for your dinners depends on, farmers. So when you have a hurricane or you have a flood or you have a drought, that will affect the pricing of your final product because it is dependent on these other products or materials. And business demand can fluctuate more than customer demand. So in this chapter, we talked about individuals and how they make buying decisions. We talked about how individuals can vary based on personality, their adopter category, their role in the decision-making process. And we discussed how buying decisions can vary based on involvement and based on whether it's a customer, an individual customer versus an organizational decision. I went a little over my 30-minute time frame for this lecture, but it's a big one, it's an important one, and I hope you see yourself in this chapter, both as an individual customer as well as a potential employee of an organization.